and welcome to our panel discussion on the French presidential election. And I have the pleasure to chair indeed the discussion tonight. I'd like to thank the European Institute at UCL, in particular Dr. Claudia Sternberg just spoke, its head of academic programs. The Institute supported the idea of this conference on the French election, and Claudia kindly helped me co-organize the event. So the discussion will last 1.5 hours. In the first hour, I will introduce consecutively our 4 guests and put some questions to each of them. I will skip the traditional 10 minutes or so presentations and start straight away with questions. We aim to make this panel as conversational and interactive as possible. And in the last half an hour, I will open the floor to you, the audience, and you'll be able to ask questions to our guests in writing by using the Q&A form, which you will find here on Zoom, and our guests will answer them. We were normally, we had 5 guests, but one of them had to pull out just this afternoon. Professor Rainbow Murray, unfortunately, isn't well, so she won't be with us tonight. She was due to make an assessment of the electoral battleground, so to speak, the different candidates, the main campaign themes, etc. So I have no time really to find a replacement. So by way of substitution, I will start now, and it will be extremely brief by flagging up a few points. There are 7, but again, I'll be extremely brief. And those 7 points, if you like, are sort of it's about flagging up the characteristics, if you like, and the main stakes in this election. Point number 1, there are, as you may know, 12 contenders, 12 candidates, 6 on the left, ranging from the Trotskyist far left to the center left, and 6 on the right, 2 of which are on the far right. Point number 2, this is in many respects an uncertain election. And there are different reasons for that, because first of all, the French electorate has been volatile for the past years. Secondly, the abstention rate is expected to be high. And thirdly, the war on Ukraine has, as you know, unexpectedly impacted everyone, but especially this election. So it has really impacted on the debates and the voters' mood. Point number 3, there is one certainty, though, no candidate will secure 50% of the share of the votes in the first round on the 10th of April, which is the date of the first round. So we know for certain that there will be a second ballot on the 24th of April. For the runoff, only 2 candidates can qualify. One spot, bar an exceptional upset, and it is really always a possibility, if you like, will be certainly attributed to the incumbent president, Emmanuel Macron. And the other main contenders, of course, there are 11 candidates, but the main contenders, let's say between 2 and 4, are now fighting for the second and last spot. Point number 4, Macron is largely ahead in the polls. However, let's take, of course, opinion polls with a pinch of salt, as usual. And an opinion polls is a snapshot, if you like, of the electorate's mood at a given time. So, of course, that electoral mood may change between now and election day. Point number, I lost here my thing, but anyway, yes, I think Claudia has projected what is the latest opinion polls. There are several opinion polls, of course, but this is one made by Ipsos, which I think is quite reliable because it's a rolling poll. Every day there's an adjustment, and the sample of interviewees is quite big. So this is where we are at present, and this is yesterday's poll, with, as I was saying, Macron largely ahead, followed by Marine Le Pen, far-right candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon for the left, Éric Zemmour, far-right, Valérie Pécresse, the main conservative candidate, and all the other candidates are really largely behind. So really, we're talking about an election for 2 spots in a second round between the first 5 candidates. But this is point number 6. The momentum seems to go with to be with the two candidates following Macron, Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who have been going up in the polls at the expense of Éric Zemmour and Valérie Pécresse. So it seems that there's a lot, and this is point number 7, my last point. There's a lot of tactical voting involved, in the sense that if you are, say, an Éric Zemmour voter, if you want to cast your vote for him, and you'll be looking at how Marine Le Pen fares and how also Mélenchon fares. If Mélenchon threatens to nick the second spot to Le Pen, probably some of Zemmour's voters might decide to vote eventually for Le Pen. The same goes with Mélenchon. If you look at all the left-wing candidates, Yannick Jadot for the Greens and Fabien Roussel for the Communist Party, some of the current voters, or at least those who have the intention of voting for Jadot or Roussel, might eventually vote for Mélenchon in order for the left to be present in a second round. This is really what I mean by tactical voting, and there will be a lot of it probably between now and an election day. So I think that that's really all about flagging up the main points. Of course, we should have had a more comprehensive assessment of the battlefield, but unfortunately, one of our guests is not there. But I'm sure we can go back to those issues of tactical voting and also opinion polls if you're interested later on. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn to and introduce our first guest, who is Sophie Pedder. Hello, Sophie, welcome. And yes, I can see you're there on the screen. Sophie is, of course, very busy because she is the Economist Paris bureau chief. So she is currently covering this uncertain, strange election, and she will tell us why it is an uncertain and strange election. She's been a Paris correspondent since 2003. She is the author of Révolution Française, Emmanuel Macron and the Quest to Reinvent a Nation, published by Bloomsbury in 2018. And this is a historic point I have to note here. It was during our interview with President Macron in 2019 that Macron spoke of the brain death of NATO. It's, of course, something which cropped up a lot lately in all conversation. I think she was one of the journalists who interviewed Macron when he spoke about NATO being brain death. That was 3 years ago. And she's also the author of Le Déni Français, published by Lattès. And in 2006, she won the David Watt Prize for Journalism. So welcome, Sophie. And so you are, of course, very well placed to give us a sense of what the election is all about this time around. You've covered several presidential elections since you've been in France. But I think what I would like to ask, which is, I think, starting with the sort of assessment of the incumbent president, Macron, who is sort of seeking re-election. And Macron seems to be, well, I think he is for sure a polarizing figure. I think that people who love him and other people who really his critiques loathe him. And it's quite difficult to work out whether he's done a good job. Of course, it depends on your opinions about that. But is it possible really to make a kind of assessment about his main policy achievements? What is done, particularly in the economic, social areas, and also probably later on in terms of law and order as well. But I think starting with probably the economy.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you for putting together this panel. It's a really great group of people you've managed to find. So thank you for that and for inviting me. Just before I answer your question, which is an excellent one, of course, I just thought it was worth adding to your list of 7 with a couple of other points. And one of them, I think, first of all, as you said, it really is one of the strangest presidential election campaigns, certainly the strangest I've ever covered. This is the 4th one I've covered, and really the mood, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the sort of sense of apprehension and candidates feeling they can't really campaign and hold rallies with that it's sort of almost indecent to do that in an ordinary way, and particularly Macron being so distracted by all his diplomacy, it means it's a very strange mood. It's quite a dark mood for the French to be holding a campaign in. And the other point I just thought was worth highlighting for those who aren't familiar with France. I mean, one of the things that's interesting looking at your polls, and if you look at the poll, polls of polls which try to get away from the single poll problem, Macron is so far ahead in the first round that this started to look like, it's starting to become sort of taken for granted. But it's worth pointing out that in the last 20 years, not a single sitting president has been re-elected in France. Generally, being the incumbent president is thought of as a huge disadvantage because everyone always wants to get rid of, at least in France, get rid of whoever governs them. And those, even under the Fifth Republic, if you go back, right back to de Gaulle being the last sort of re-elected president, but if you take him aside, the only two presidents who have been re-elected, so that's Chirac and Mitterrand, both of them were re-elected periods of cohabitation. So they were governing with a government of a different political family, and therefore there was a sense in which they could blame, all the troubles of the moment on that government. So I think if we are looking at the possibility that Macron is re-elected, then it's worth just bearing in mind what an unusual, historically unusual event that would be. So that was just something I thought was worth adding. On your points about looking back at the economic record for Emmanuel Macron, I think I would divide it into sort of two phases. There was really that reformist phase before, right when he was elected, when he came in, and it was like a kind of whirlwind of putting in place reforms, starting with fiscal reforms, tax cuts, reforming the labor market with decrees, these ordonnances that were passed in the summer of 2017. He was going through in a very un-French fashion, to my mind, going through his election manifesto and sort of just ticking them all off. And this was quite a sort of shocking moment in some respects, because there has been that tradition, as everyone knows, of campaigning with one sort of list of policies and actually governing with another. So it came as it did feel like a kind of whirlwind of reform, with an uncertain sense at that moment as to where that was all going to lead. And then, of course, a year, 18 months later, along came the Gilets jaunes protests, and that just sort of threw everything up in the air. And it was really the end of what I see as that period of sort of Macron the reformist in an economic sense. The crisis was very serious. It revealed all sorts of fractures in France that had been, I think, underestimated by both Macron and the government. And it led to ultimately a very different form of governing and a different way of thinking about economic policy and about making of policy. And then along came the pandemic. And then we've seen since then, I think, a much more the return of big government, a much less liberal agenda, and a much more sort of big state, big spending agenda under Macron. So I think in many respects that sums him up. It's very difficult to identify what sort of program or what sort of position Macron occupies. I noted earlier, Philippe, you listed him as one of the 6 candidates on the right. I think those members of the Socialist or former members of the Socialist Party who sit in his government would be quite surprised by that. They think of themselves as centrist, or at very least, neither on the left and neither on the right. Although it is absolutely true that some of his economic policies, especially the tax cutting, are identified with the left. So just to go sort of move quickly onto some of the kind of what's been the result. I think the most dramatic result, to my mind, has been 2 things. One has been the labour market. We've seen unemployment fall during a pandemic from about 9% when Macron took over to about 7% now, and he's now promising full employment, so to bring it down to 5% if he was re-elected for 5 years. That in France would be historic. And in that labour market, some really interesting things have happened. For example, the share of people aged over 50, so 50 to 64, still in the labour market, who are actually employed, has gone up to a historic level. That's quite unusual in France, where traditionally the sort of 25 to 50-year-olds have had pretty good employment rates, but younger and older workers haven't. We've seen a record number of apprenticeships being created. So there's been a real effort to sort of improve training across the board. So I think if you're looking at examples of where things have improved, I think the labour market is one of the most important. And the other area is the whole sort of entrepreneurial tech sector in France, which over 5 years has just been transformed. Macron promised to create 25 or create the environment that could lead to the emergence of 25 unicorns. So tech firms valued at $1 billion by 2025. And this has already been reached in January this year. And I think that figure itself speaks a lot about the way in which a lot of young people now, they don't want to go and work in big corporates anymore. They're really much more sort of less risk averse, more risk taking, and happy to set up all sorts of startups in lots of domains. So those, I think, on the economic front are the two sort of most interesting metrics. I would add on that front, though, that we're still looking at a very divided France. Those fractures are still there. You can see them geographically across the country. I was in the mining basin earlier this week, and it's really, these are sort of Le Pen voting areas, and there's a reason for it. It's an area, these are the places that were categorized as left behind France or peripheral France. Call them what you want, but they remain so, and Macron hasn't sort of managed to bridge those fractures. Shall I stop there, because I could go on? I should probably stop at that point, and we can come
yes.
to those points.
Yes, I think we'll certainly get back to the Macron's record, economic record. That is, I think I put your although I didn't say it, I certainly put Macron amongst the 6 right-wing candidates, so to speak. Of course, there's a sort of a range of different types of right-wing candidates, and it's not really me. I think it's probably, to be fair, how a lot of commentators in France where they would put him. Although, and this is the big puzzle about Macron. He comes, let's remember, he was the Minister of the Economy in a socialist or social democratic government in 2017, got elected with a new party. And at the time, and this is a good transition for my second question, by the way, promising really to do politics differently, to sort of propose to happily mix up, if you like, what's best on the center left and what's best on the center right. But it seems that 5 years on, probably a lot of people would consider he's become a kind of a more traditional it's always hard to use the word right wing, because probably it sounds very, very harsh in a sort of an Anglo-American context. But in France, one uses the words left and right all the time, meaning simply is really, the political center is not a position you can really sustain. He's really leaning to the right. And lately, Valérie Pécresse, the main conservative candidates, complain that Macron has stolen some of his policies. You know that. I think there are some measures, like, for instance, retirement age pushed to 65, cuts on inheritance tax, also lots of sort of unhappiness for public sector workers. So all that would tend to show that it's very hard now to sort of claim that Macron is on the left, even the center left, even if, as you said, there are now people in his government, in the cabinet who come from the Socialist Party. But let's move on. I'm sure there will be questions about that, and you have a chance to get back to it. It's the idea that Macron would be a very different reformer. When he was elected, not simply because he was young, which was quite unusual in French politics, but because clearly he wanted to overcome what really shapes French political life very deeply, which is the divide between the left and the right. And with him, it would be different. That divide would go away, and probably it would be the first centrist candidate, turning equally to the right and the left. 5 years down the line, do you think is managed to do that? Or, we're going back to the same question, or has he, those 5 years have really shown that Macron was in fact a kind of conservative in disguise, although coming from the center left, but he's not clearly, on the right. He's not, you can't claim that he is a kind of center left reformer.
I don't think I haven't heard anyone trying to claim he's centre-left, but I think I will go back to my point about it being centrist. I mean, in some respects, I sort of feel he does a little bit what Tony Blair started to do, you know, in these early days, which is borrow whatever works from whatever side of the political spectrum it comes from. And if you look at some of the stuff he's done, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of measures in his manifesto, like the retirement age, which do look as if they could, but they could be in a centre-right political program. And then you look at things like some of his social measures, like halving the class sizes in education priority areas, free breakfasts in the same areas, school. All university students have their meals capped at €1 a day. You have IVF treatment now available for all, reimbursed for all gay women, including single gay women. You have a sort of number of measures that would be very difficult to imagine existing in a Républicain manifesto. So I think, you know, he defies labels. I think that, you know, I quite see where you're coming from, Philippe, and I know you classify him on the centre right, but I do think it's more of a kind of pragmatic, slightly eclectic and centrist position, which makes him very difficult, I think, to classify in that respect. On the party political spectrum, I mean, this is on landscape rather, this is just sort of so interesting to see how what I think's happened is in 2017, he effectively pretty much killed off the Socialist Party. I mean, it was one of the great parties of post-war politics in France. It supplied 2 presidents. It's been responsible for some of the most progressive social legislation in France. It at one point held the presidency, the Senate, the National Assembly, the majority of the regions, most town halls. And it has been reduced to, a candidate who's not even polling 5%, which is the barrier you need in order to get your campaign expenses reimbursed. And they've had to sell off their, mansion that they used to operate out of on the Paris left bank. They are a party that is a really pale shadow of itself in national politics. I don't mean that. And I think in that respect, it's interesting because the point I'm trying to make doesn't necessarily apply to local politics, but in national politics as vehicles, as party political vehicles for securing the French presidency, the Socialist Party has been weakened. And what we're now seeing, I think, is a mirror image of that on the right, that Macron is now doing exactly the same to the Républicain Party. That's to say that as a vehicle capable of carrying a credible candidate to the presidency, the Republicans failed last time, and it looks like they're about to fail again. And that, I think, is what we're witnessing now. As I said, at local level, this is not still the case, and a lot of cities and regions, and certainly a lot of town halls, are still governed, a majority of them. And Macron did very, very badly at municipal elections in 2021. So I think we're looking at a sort of disconnect somewhere between those parties' ability to exist, function efficiently on the ground, and their inability to do so as vehicles of the presidency, which leaves Macron against the extremes as the sort of national political situation.
Yes, I agree with that. And I should say, wherever you position Macron on the political spectrum, centrist or center right, we might disagree on that. But anyway, I think his action is impacting on party politics in France, and also voting behavior, because as you said, he's seriously weakened the Socialist Party. I would even say he's been siphoning off the party. The Socialist candidate is now credited with 2% of the share of the vote. So that's, as you were saying, a party which had two of its candidates elected president in the past, a governing party multiple times. Now 2%, which is almost neck and neck with the Trotskyist candidate, which is absolutely incredible. So there is something going on, but also on the right, he's been siphoning off the electorate of Valérie Pécresse. I think there's a clear slump, and I think in general, also you have to look at the support he's received from elected officials from both parties. So my last question to you for the time being is that, how far can he go in the realignment of French politics, because what he's been doing, at least Macron, wherever he stands politically on the political spectrum, is seriously weaken the once too dominant party in French politics.
I think that's right, and I think what we're looking at is, and this I think will happen the minute that we've passed the first round, and before we, as you know, that there are parliamentary elections coming up in June. So we've got 2 rounds of the presidential election and then 2 rounds of a parliamentary election. But as soon as the first round has passed, I think what we're going to look at, and assuming Valérie Pécresse does not get through to the second round, what we're looking at is going to be a complete implosion on the right. I think that things are going to be extremely fluid, that the concept of the sort of political party and where the boundaries lie is going to become quite blurred, and there could be all sorts of outcomes and realignments on the right. And we're looking at the full spectrum all the way across to the far right, where, you know, we've now got 2 candidates, Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour. We've got disillusioned members of the Republican Party who I think would quite like to change strategy completely and realign with a candidate like Eric Zemmour. And then you've got other members of the Republicans Party who are going to feel disappointed because Valérie Pécresse wasn't centrist enough. And that could split the party altogether with somebody like Laurent Wauquiez, who is the president of the Rhône-Alpes Auvergne region, and is a right-wing member of the Republicans Party, is exactly the kind of character who will want to come straight back in and realign party politics on the right with a sort of more nationalist policy. So I think that what we are looking at is a very volatile party political situation, which will be revealed the moment that first round is passed, if, as polls suggest, Valérie Pécresse doesn't make it through to the runoff. Obviously, as you said right at the beginning, all these things one has to be very careful about, and things can move. But at the moment, that's what looks like is the most likely outcome on April the 10th.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And we could go on for long, but I need to move on to our next guest, and I'm sure you'll get a chance to sort of get back to some of those issues later. So our second guest is Aurélien Mondon, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bath, where he teaches and researches politics, and his research focuses on the impact of racism and populism on liberal democracies, and, this is highly topical, the mainstreaming of far-right politics through elite discourse. Aurélien, you published your first book, which is titled The Mainstreaming of the Extreme Right in France and Australia, a Populist Hegemony, in 2013. And I think you were ahead of the pack then, because that issue of mainstreaming of far-right ideas, particularly in France, is really highly topical. Recently, you co-edited after Charlie Hebdo, Terror, Racism and Free Speech, and your most recent book, co-authored with Aaron Winter, is called Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. So we, of course, wanted to invite you to discuss this unheard of situation, even by French standards, of a far right, which now total over 30% of the share of the vote, because I think there's consensus in France to designate Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour as far-right candidates, although they don't quite like it to be labeled far-right, but that's what the media and all commentators, political scientists say. And my first question is how do you explain this steady rise? Because for a very long time, there was only one strong candidate on the far right, Jean-Marie Le Pen, then his daughter Marine, and there was always talks about a ceiling, a glass ceiling. They couldn't go beyond a certain threshold, but now look, 30% plus. So where are we going? How do you explain this new situation?
Well, thanks, Philippe, and thanks for inviting me to this panel first. How do I explain the situation? Well, one thing that is very interesting with the rise of the far right, I think whether it's in France or elsewhere, is that we tend to see it it tends to be read as a shock, as some kind of earthquake. And this is something that we witnessed in France in 2002 when Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round of a presidential election. All the kind of newspapers, magazines talked about the earthquake, the shock, the bomb, the tsunami, or, the death of democracy, or the potential death of democracy, fascism at the door. And I think, in a way, 2022 really reminds me of 2002. And I think while we need to be very, very concerned about the rise of the far and the extreme right, and in fact, I would go further than you in a way and define Marine Le Pen as far right and Éric Zemmour as extreme right, and we can come back to that a bit later, because I think Zemmour actually has something different to offer than Marine Le Pen. But I think if we want to understand where they're coming from, we need to take that long view in many ways, and it's very important to take that long view and not to just read into the rise of a far and extreme right, their own doing in a way, the fact that they're cunning, the fact that they're tapping into legitimate grievances or even popular grievances. And that's why I'm always very cautious not to call these parties populists, for example. Not to say that they might not be using populist discourse, but first and foremost, they're far right and they're extreme right. What we missed in 2002 is what we risk missing, I think, in 2022. What we missed in 2002 was the fact that actually Jean-Marie Le Pen wasn't that popular. Jean-Marie Le Pen was actually stagnating. He was getting more or less the same number of votes that he got in 95 and that he got in 88. So we had Jean-Marie Le Pen plateauing more or less. And what happens instead is, again, very similar to what Sophie was talking about before, this kind of realignment, this kind of disillusionment with mainstream politics or with the mainstream parties, which were, back in the day, as you were saying, the Socialist Party on the center left, the kind of centrist party and the kind of center right. And there was a massive disillusion. Everyone thought that the second round would be Jospin versus Chirac, and people were like, well, either I'll vote for something different because I'm not a big fan of either of them, or I just simply won't turn up because I'm not motivated. And what happened is, just by stagnating, Jean-Marie Le Pen gets to the second round. It's a shock. It's absolutely dreadful, and this should have never happened. But I think what the problem was, from my point of view there, is that we didn't learn any lesson from 2002. The lesson we learned was fascism was at the door. We need to defeat fascism. Well, actually, the problem was the crisis of democracy in France, which has worsened ever since. What happened in 2002 then is you get Nicolas Sarkozy, who's on the rise, who says he's going to steal the Front National voters one by one. He moves rightward. He gets elected in 2007, mainstreams the discourse further. And what you get then is Marine Le Pen, a more kind of palatable candidate that, sanitizes the party, moves the party towards the mainstream, but also the mainstream moving towards the more radical positions on Islam, on immigration, the Minister of National Identity and Immigration that Sarkozy created, all of these kind of things. Then you get, of course, François Hollande, who gets elected, but you get still a movement to the right with Manuel Valls, who's really tapping into a discourse that can be very easily considered far right. And finally, you get to Emmanuel Macron. And again, we haven't necessarily learned the mistakes we haven't learned all the lessons from 2018. Again, pitting Emmanuel Macron against Marine Le Pen. And I know it was the second round, but Marine Le Pen could have failed to get to the second round in 2018. The second, third, and fourth candidates were very close from each other, and it wouldn't have taken much for either Mélenchon or Fillon to overtake Le Pen and to change the discourse entirely. And I think this is something that we forget often about the far right, is that the far right is only there because of a lot of reasons, not just because they're very cunning, they're popular, but also because the way we talk about them in the mainstream media, the way we talk about them in politics, and the role that all of these people play in a way. And you can see that if we come to 2022, you can see that with the rise of Zemmour. Zemmour is not coming from anywhere. Zemmour is not some kind of grassroots candidate that comes up because people really love him. Zemmour has been a mainstream politician in France for a very long time. I'm saying mainstream not in terms of politics. He's always been on the extreme right. He's always been very clear about his politics, which are very much, on the extreme right side of politics in terms of racism, homophobia, sexism, and so on. But he was a very mainstream politician in terms of his access to platforms, in terms of his access to publishers, his access to even liberal TV shows. He became very famous, like being on Laurent Ruquier, for example, his TV show, which is like what would be considered here or in the US a liberal kind of TV show, and Ruquier has regretted it since and said he's regretted it, but the damage was done. And again, Zemmour didn't come from anywhere, and we can see here the continuous importance of the mainstream media and how he was able to kind of shape the early stages of the campaign until we got, of course, the war in Ukraine, which has, I think, kind of taken the steam out of his ability to shape the agenda. So this is quite interesting again, and we can see also how the role that not just the mainstream media, but also mainstream parties have played in legitimizing all these ideas. And in 2022, you don't have to look very far to see the impact that discourse has had. If you think about, for example, the way Pécresse has mentioned the Great Replacement in an interview, which of course then she has backtracked ever since, but that's a breakaway again from what could have been said 20 years ago. The same way Sarkozy mentioned certain things in 2007 or 2012, but also the way Emmanuel Macron's government has handled certain issues, the way, for example, Darmanin told Marine Le Pen that she was too soft on Islam in a very famous debate that they were holding. On the left, the way Mélenchon accepted to debate Éric Zemmour, giving him a platform as well and legitimizing his idea through a simple idea of debating him. But even on the communist left with Roussel, who has been talking about, being French is about drinking wine and eating saucisson, if I'm correct. There was the drinking wine. Was it saucisson? I can't remember, but you'll tell me, Philippe. I'm sure you remember this. So I think we can see, again, this kind of shift in discourse. And I think that's what we need to remember with the 2022 election, is that the results of the first round will be very important. But what we do with these results will be just as important. Because if Marine Le Pen, let's say, doesn't get to the second round, and instead we have the so-called center-right candidate, Pécresse, going through, or Mélenchon, we shouldn't think that the far right has been defeated the way we read it in a way in 2007. What we should think about is what happened and look at the results and all of that. And if Marine Le Pen gets to the second round, we shouldn't make her more popular than she really is. Because I do believe that there's still a glass ceiling there, that is still there, and that most French people and most French voters would not vote for the far right. And that's why it's going to be very, very important to look at the turnout, because what mattered in 2002 was the turnout. What will matter in 2022 will be the turnout, and it's likely to be very, very high. And the higher the turnout, the easier it is to get to the second round in a way, because you need far fewer votes to get a higher percentage of the vote.
Yes. You said earlier, Aurélien, and that's very interesting, you made a distinction between the two candidates. One which you labeled far right, I think it was Le Pen, and the other one, Zemmour, extreme right. And could you explain the difference? And I think we'd like to understand, if those two candidates cater for different electorates. Are they different politically? Are they politically compatible? That's really the theme, the differences, if there are any.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And obviously terminological debates there's something I'm really fascinated in, but I understand that not everyone is, so I'll try and keep it simple. But the way I understand far right, if you want, or the way I define far right parties in my research, are parties that have tried to reconstruct themselves, to mainstream themselves, to move away from obvious the most obvious forms of racism and racist discourse, if you want, and the most kind of obvious form of authoritarianism. The Front National is a case in point here. And it's not just Marine Le Pen, this is a long process of normalization, of moving from the kind of obvious biological racism of the 1970s and the early days of the Front National, which was a neo-fascist party, really, all the way to kind of Bruno Maigret, Jean-Marie Le Pen toning down some of his rhetoric, even though he was still kind of tapping into Holocaust denialism and so on, to then Marine Le Pen pushing that further, of course, being a different person. So this is what I call far right. And Marine Le Pen, in a way, to some extent, has been the victim of the success of that process of normalization. She has managed to normalize the party, not just through her own doing, but also through the fact that, as I said before, mainstream politicians, mainstream media accepted a lot of her discourse, accepted to call her a populist instead of far right or extreme right, and so on and so forth. And by doing this, Marine Le Pen has maybe become far more ambitious than I think her father was. I don't think her father ever expected to win elections. His aim was really to kind of shift the discourse. And I think Marine Le Pen became ambitious enough to think that maybe she could. But we saw what happened in 2017. And as soon as she got to the second round, she went back to kind of her extreme right or far right kind of attitudes, if you want. And her debate against Macron was quite incredible, actually, on this. And I think she failed really, really badly there to kind of show that. And she showed in a way that normalization process was very much a veneer rather than actually the reality of the Front National. But what happened in the aftermath was that it created a space with a lot of people who were still part of the Front National at the time, but were unhappy with the way the Front National was going, because Marine Le Pen was cautious on a number of issues. You could think, for example, of gay marriage in France, where even though she was more or less opposed to it, she never was openly opposed to it, while Marion Maréchal, her niece, was openly campaigning and demonstrating with the mariage pour tous. And on various other issues where she's been a bit more careful. On Islam, even, she's been a bit more careful, which led her to be attacked, as I said, by Gérald Darmanin, who is the interior minister of Emmanuel Macron. And so that created a space on the kind of further right, if you want, what I would call the extreme right, which is what Zemmour tapped in. Zemmour has been unashamed about his positions, and he's always been, from his first book in 2006, Le Premier Sexe, which was a dig at Simone de Beauvoir's Le Second Sexe. I mean, that book is absolutely incredible, like in the extreme politics that and conspiratorial politics that it's pushing forward. And to me, I mean, this has always, having read that book very, very carefully as part of my research, it's always amazed me that he was given so many prominent mainstream platforms afterwards, that he was invited on so many mainstream shows, the mainstream shows that Marine Le Pen could never dream of, even though, she is a bit less extreme than he is, and she still is very extreme from my point of view. She shouldn't have a space on these shows, but Zemmour was invited as a guest, as a bit of a kind of, as a bit of an interesting character, putting out there things that people can't say anymore, all of this kind of thing, contrarian. And I think, again, it takes us back to the responsibility that mainstream actors have in, platforming, giving space, giving credence to ideas that honestly are not particularly popular in France, or are made popular because they are put left, front, and center. I mean, if you look at the way we talk about Islam in France, for example, the way we talk about immigration, all of these kind of things, if you ask people, what their main concerns are, personally, immigration, Islam does not rate. No one cares about it. If you ask them what their main concerns are nationally, immigration becomes much more important. Islam becomes much more important. And that's what we should kind of discuss, how is this knowledge mediated? Why is it that people seem to care? And that takes us back to the elections, local versus national, right? Why do people have different concerns in a way? And particularly when these concerns are clearly moral panics, because most people don't really understand what they're talking about when they're talking about Islam in France. And I think all of this is, has led to a mainstreaming of the far right, which is that there's more space for the far right to grow, but also to a split within the far right, which is, do you then try and tap into the mainstream right electorate, or even the left electorate, the way Marine Le Pen has tried more or less successfully with the working class? Or do you just go on a kind of discursive war, what Bruno Maigret in the 1990s was calling a vocabulary war, based on Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony, which is, to win political power, you first need to win cultural power. And so by imposing ideas, even though they're incredibly extreme, even though you have no chance of winning, you are putting them right, front, and center, and you are forcing people to engage with them. And this is something that the far right and the extreme right have done very successfully, from my point of view, in the last 20, 30 years. And I think that's the real lesson we need to learn, rather than them winning or losing in a way, electorally at least.
Thank you, Aurélien, for this very comprehensive answer. Just a last question for the time being about Valérie Pécresse and Les Républicains. Sophie earlier has touched on the situation for the main Conservative Party, squeezed between Macron and the far right. So what are the political prospects, very briefly, for Pécresse?
It's very hard to say. Obviously, things could change, but I mean, she's facing an incredibly busy like area in politics, right? There's Macron, who's tapping into the center right economically, but also culturally to some extent with Darmanin, and then there's Marine Le Pen, who is also tapping into her electorate, and Zemmour, who's tapping in the more kind of conservative, more kind of upper class, middle class electorate that would traditionally go to the Républicains if they didn't have Zemmour. So I think she's facing a very small space, or a very crowded space, and I think she will struggle. And it is interesting to see who she was opposed to in the primaries with Les Républicains, and we can see the divide. And I think that's what Sophie talked about very well, and about the choices that will have to be made after the first round if she doesn't qualify. Is it going towards more a kind of former Gaullist type person who's a bit more social and all that? Or is it going towards more a Wauquiez type or Ciotti type, who is far more kind of would kind of realign everything and would be trying to occupy the space that the Front National, or the Rassemblement National, and Zemmour is occupying at the moment. So yeah, it will be very interesting to see what happens, but it seems like she might not make it, I think.
It's a difficult situation indeed. Thank you very much, Aurélien. We're going to move now to our third guest, Cole Stangler. Hi. Cole, you're like Sophie in Paris also, I suppose. You're a journalist, so covering also the French elections. You cover French politics in general and labor issues also. You're a business editor at France 24 English, and you contribute to The Nation, Jacobin, the New York Times, and Washington Post. You've published recently a very interesting book on the CFDT, French trade union. The title is La solidarité, ses limites, la CFDT et les travailleurs immigrés dans les années 68. And you are currently working on a book about working class Paris. Very interesting. Look forward to the publication of that. So hi, Cole. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here with us. We're going to talk about the left. And I think it's quite, we saw the latest opinion, Ipsos opinion poll, and I think we could start by stating a paradox. The left is clearly weak, and it's been weak for a while already. If you put the 6 candidates together, the total voting intention is 27%, which is less than the 2 candidates of the far right, just amazing. However, one of them, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, stands a chance as we speak to just make it and get the 2nd spot and qualify for the 2nd round, which is, I think, a big paradox. And I think, I'm sure you'd like to sort of reflect on this paradox and also try to explain why the weakness of the left. Why hasn't the left recovered from 5 years of Macron, who is not seen, as we've said so far, really as a left-winger, to say the least. So why hasn't the Mélenchon, why has he failed to capitalize on its very good score in 2017, almost 20% of the share of the vote? Aurélien said it, he almost made it to the 2nd round then. Socialist Party is in free fall, it seems. Some would say it's terminal decline, will never recover. So we'll see. What do you make of this actual weakness?
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Philippe, and glad to be on this panel with all these other guests as well. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to discuss there. Maybe just to start one issue. I think one of the big problems for the left is that it still has never really recovered from the François Hollande presidency, from the disaster of the Hollande presidency. So much so to the point that today even the word left, gauche in French, is seen as a label that people want to run from or not necessarily embrace. And you see that not only with France Insoumise, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the candidate who you mentioned, who's at about 15% in the polls right now. That goes as well to the Greens as well. They don't really like to talk about the left. Even the communists as well. And so, we don't want to get too caught up in semantics here, but I think that shows you something, that even this word is seen as a label that's not something you want to be associated with, because again, it sort of harkens back to this, failure of the Hollande presidency, who was elected, if you remember, back in 2012 on not a radical platform, but on a platform aimed at shaking things up. If you remember his campaign slogan, it was, change is now, in English. He had a very famous speech on the campaign trail in which he said that his main enemy was finance. And so he really promised to sort of shake up things, to sort of tackle the austerity regime, both on the European level and on the French level. And, the end result was none of those changes really happened. And so not only did we have the sort of the right-wing opposition to Hollande that was always going to be there, but he ultimately upset a big chunk of his electoral bloc, the voters that tended to vote for the socialists and would vote socialists in the 2nd round. And what's interesting today is when you look at the big disconnect between the historic base of the left, which is the working class voters. In French, they tend to be, there's 2 categories we talk about, which are employés, which are sort of service sector workers, and ouvriers, which are more manual workers. These 2 categories, which have become very disconnected from left-wing parties. Even if you look at Hollande in 2012, when he was elected, you still had some amount of working class support for the left. And that really hasn't recovered. So I think the Hollande presidency is really a really pivotal turning point. That's very important. I think to maybe join something that Aurélien was mentioning, we're in this media climate that is very amenable to not just far right candidates, but to far right ideas. And I think that is weighing on the sort of general political climate in France. It's harder to make arguments in favor of investing in public services, in redistributing wealth, and having a massive investment in green energy, when a lot of the media is talking about things like immigration, like crime, like Islam, like national identity. And I want to be careful here because, and me and Aurélien have sort of gone back and forth about this a little bit on Twitter. But I think at the same time, we should be careful as well to acknowledge, I mean, there's a real demand for this sort of, I think this sort of far right politics that we can't deny. At the same time, as Aurélien was mentioning, the media sort of climate has, I think, amplified these issues, and it's very hard for the left to break through in this sort of environment. So the Hollande legacy looms very large. The media climate, sort of dominated by or amenable to the far right, is not favorable. And maybe to answer the question about Mélenchon, I think we have to be a little nuanced as well when we look at, you know, why hasn't he capitalized on his score in 2017? Back in 2017, he received about a fifth of the vote, I think 19.6%, just below 20%. Today, if you look at the polls, okay, he's not that far below that 2017 score. He's at around 15%, but still, you know, it's a valid question. Why are we not seeing him at that same level, if not higher, given where we're at today in French politics? I mean, one, very simply, is there's a lot of division on the left. As anyone who's been following this would know, you know, you have the difference with 2017 is that now Mélenchon is running against the Communist Party, which has its own candidate after backing La France Insoumise, after backing Mélenchon as candidate for the last two election cycles in 2012 and 2017. The Communists have their own candidate who has, you know, 3-4% of the vote. He's taking that away from Mélenchon. The Greens also have their own candidate this time around after backing the Socialists back in 2017. Yannick Jadot is peeling off some support from Mélenchon voters in 2017. And I think, you know, that division is certainly not helpful. That's one factor. I think another very important factor is, you know, I think that the strategy of La France Insoumise coming out of 2017 has sort of veered radically between different positions, and the result has been it hasn't been terribly clear where the party is headed, and that's had an impact on voters. So very concretely, the party has gone from immediately coming out of that 2017 election wanting to essentially demolish the other parties on the left, replace the other parties on the left. They were unable to pass, uninterested and unable to pass significant legislative deals with even the Communist Party in 2017. They've gone from this position of wanting to demolish the competition, especially the socialists, to then saying that actually they want to unite the left and be at the front of uniting the left. And that's what we saw, for example, in the strategy for the 2019 European elections, which then upset a lot of people within La France Insoumise who were convinced at the necessity of this other strategic line. And we saw sort of a combination of both of these lines in the regional and the municipal elections that followed in the 2020 and 2021. So strategic, you know, sort of waffling, I think that's played a role. And then finally, the last factor about Mélenchon is, I think, you know, I don't think we should overstate this as well. But, you know, his personality is seen as, you know, he's seen as abrasive by many. He's seen as sort of, grumpy, mercurial, loses his temper. And the personality of Mélenchon, I think, has turned off a lot of would-be voters. If you look at his actual program, there's one very famous episode I'll mention very quickly. There was a police raid on his party's headquarters as part of an investigation into campaign finance, and Mélenchon famously lost his temper in front of a journalist. You know, just enraged and had this one quip where he said, "La République c'est moi." You know, I am the Republic, referring to a court officer, and you know, I think he was referring to, he's a legislator, so technically he represents the Republic, but it didn't matter because obviously, you know, the message was not well received. So I think all those factors explain why Mélenchon isn't doing better than he is.
Yeah, to prolong the point you've just made, and I think it's a vast question, so just answer very briefly. What would it take for the left to overcome its lack of unity?
Yeah, I mean, that's the that's the $1 million question. I mean, I think the short answer is it's very difficult to imagine that happening before the end of this election cycle. Everyone is invested in maintaining their presidential campaigns, and that goes for the Greens and the Communists. People are also invested in having a good score for the legislative elections, which also determine party funding. So there's incentives to keep up the division right now. I think the window, we could see things change once we've passed the election cycle, depending on who's president, probably Macron, despite even if Mélenchon got in the second round. And that's where we could see the real shakeup is potentially under a Macron presidency, a sort of, shakeup and new generation saying, this sort of way they've been conducting themselves over the last few years has not been terribly effective.
All right. And now moving on to the next final question for the time being, at least. It's about the theme of droitisation, which translates in English like shift to the right. And that's a way of explaining why the left is so weakened in France, is that the French society as a whole has shifted so much to the right that, of course, the values of the left, the policies, anything which has to do with the left is out of favor. And I wonder what you make of that thesis, which is very, very big in the media, in political science, also political science debated. How convincing is the thesis to you? And if there is something called droitisation, what are we talking about exactly?
Yeah, I think there's this idea that you see this a lot in the press. This idea that the French electorate, and Aurélien referenced it as well, is basically becoming more conservative, and that if we're talking about crime, Islam, immigration, Islam identity, it's because this is what people want. And I'm not terribly convinced by that. I don't think that's true. I think to get back to a point I was making prior to wind up to make this point, I think it's important to stress there is a base for this sort of politics. I don't know how you can look at the score that the far right has in the polls today, 30%, and conclude otherwise. Like, these are far right politicians, and this is something that would have been inconceivable, even 5 years ago. So there is a base for this sort of politics, but I don't think they're representative of mainstream opinion, majority opinion. You have other polls that, if you look at election polls of what issues voters care about, voters are interested in cost of living, in public services, in healthcare. Immigration is not at the top of that list, nor is crime. So I don't think voters' concerns align with this narrative. There is a base for this sort of politics, and I think if we want to talk about this sort of shift to the right, the main shift that's happening, again, without neglecting the fact there's a base, the main shift that's happening is in the media and political culture in France. And I think you really need to look at the way that the media landscape has changed in this country. Just in the last few years, we've seen one network in particular called CNews emerge, owned by Vincent Bolloré indirectly, but is responding to his orders. Vincent Bolloré, a conservative billionaire who is bent on spreading far-right ideas and narratives into the mainstream for his political agenda and those of his allies. CNews has getting very good ratings. Certain months, the most watched news network in France, very Fox News-like, both in terms of the issues and even just the style of having, debates that aren't really debates, having the chyrons at the bottom of the screen that show provocative statements. CNews is one thing. Vincent Bolloré, that conservative billionaire, has bought up another radio station. Again, Europe 1, helping to propel these ideas into the mainstream. So you have this aggressive far-right media. You also have, and this is sort of, again, joining what Aurélien was saying, you have a mainstream media that amplifies these issues and concerns, not because they have necessarily some ideological affinity to them, although some might, but essentially because this is good. It makes for good entertainment. It makes for good clicks. It makes for good television. Zemmour is an excellent TV pundit. If you had the chance to watch him on CNews, if you haven't, I'd encourage you just to watch clips of them, so you can sort of see the personality. And his clips then get replayed, and they create debates based off the clips. And I think this sort of media culture is very important to take into account. So those two elements. Final element, very quickly, I'll mention is that the government, too, Macron's party has decided for political reasons that it is worth engaging with these issues that come from the far right, because they've decided that it benefits them politically. Not getting into questions about whether or not they really believe it or not, but you have the Minister of Education bemoaning the spread of cancel culture and wokeness, and how wokeness is infiltrating French schools, organizing conferences at the Sorbonne to criticize wokeness and American ideas, talking about how anti-racist separatists are taking over the education system, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's not the primary factor, but the government has played a role in amplifying these narratives because they think it benefits them for political reasons. People like Darmanin, people like the education minister, the higher education minister as well, talking about fighting Islamoleftism. I could go on, but let's not neglect that other factor as well. The government has done this.
Yes, not to mention the Islamo-gauchist, Islamo-leftist, allegedly in academia. That's also one of the other accusations. Thank you very much, Cole. I think I've seen in the chat there's a question on CNews, so I think we'll get back to the role of the media, which in France have changed dramatically over the past years. So now we're sort of we're going to our last guest and speaker, Shada Islam, who runs her own Brussels-based advisory and strategic company called New Horizons Project. She's currently senior advisor at European Policy Center and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, as well as visiting professor at the College of Europe. Shada is a regular contributor to EU Observer, The Guardian, and East Asia Forum, as well as editor of the EU Observer magazine. She specializes in European politics, EU external policies, and is a leading expert on EU-Asia and EU-Africa relations. She's also a leading EU expert and commentator on racism, diversity, and inclusion in Europe, and we'll talk about that in the last part of our discussion. Welcome, Shada. Very nice to see you here.
Thanks, Philippe.
I think let's broaden the horizons, so to speak, and talk about Macron's presidency with regards to Europe. He was probably 5 years ago the only one of the rare candidates to promote further European integration in a pool of candidates which were fairly Eurosceptic, left and right. So he really strongly promoted France in Europe as a sort of staunch pro-European. So 5 years down the line, where are we? What is his record on Europe? We started with Sophie, the record on the economy. What is his record? Has he achieved anything, good? Or has he been a reformer in Europe? Has he made a difference?
Yes, Philippe, thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me. So France in the EU is a bit like Las Vegas. What happens in France doesn't stay in France, So France, I think on 3 levels is a very influential player, obviously because founding member of the European Union, second largest economy, all of that. And we've always had this legend of, France and Germany. Nothing happens in Europe unless France and Germany work together as the locomotive. And Macron, of course, keeps to the tradition of French government of being very pro-European, thinking far ahead about European integration. And so on that level, the first level is really historically a very, very important player, regardless of whether it's Sarkozy or Hollande or Mitterrand. France has always played a big role. Macron's personality, of course, Philippe, as Sophie and Aurélien and Cole have talked about it. I mean, this is a very special, charismatic personality, difficult to define. And of course, he has his fans in Europe. I mean, we in Europe, many people, when he was elected president, I mean, there were celebrations because, he did the whole pro-European thing. And there's a great deal of feeling here that, he is smart, he's very intelligent, he talked about things that others don't dare talk about, what you referred to, Philippe, initially as the statement on NATO as being brain dead. I mean, I can't really see any other European leader. I'm not talking about Britain at the moment, outside as you are in Britain. But, that was a kind of sort of daring statements. And people I remember at that time were sort of like, oh my God, he's killing off the Western Alliance, how dare he? But, he went there and he made that statement to Sophie. So he makes people sit up and take notice. And now, of course, there is this sort of mystery and aura about him as the Putin whisperer, if you like, the Zelensky whisperer. He's the wartime president in France and a bit the wartime president for the European Union as well. So he brings a lot of that kind of, aura with him, celebrity and aura with him. Now, of course, also France is in the EU presidency chair. So, you've got, and many people were saying, you've got France presidency and there will be presidential elections. So is there going to be influence, is he going to be influenced by what's happening in the elections and bring that sort of the agenda, if you like, to the European Union? I think that has been happening. And, Aurélien and Cole have referred to the sort of populist rhetoric that's sort of seeping in, and we'll talk about that a bit later. I think actually at the moment, a couple of things. He's got great fans here in Europe. So Charles Michel, who's the president of the EU Council, and Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the European Commission, are great fans and great friends with Macron. Ursula von der Leyen owes her post and her nomination to Macron, who pushed her forward. So a lot of what comes out of his mouth, as it were, or his what he likes to bring forward are very quickly championed by these two people. And then, of course, he has his fans, of course, in the European Parliament as well, and his links with the media. Also, Scholz, the new German chancellor, is not a very charismatic man. And in the past, of course, you had Angela Merkel and Macron working together, and they had sort of equal weight and equal interest by the media, if you like. So I remember as a journalist, going to conferences and trying to juggle whether you'd go to Macron or Merkel. But now it's a no-brainer. You really do go to Macron. It's just to give you a very personal thing. So on the internal side, Philippe, what we've got, you may have heard or may not have heard about this whole debate about strategic autonomy, or rather the drive towards strategic autonomy of the European Union, which is, of course, about being different, slightly different from the United States, having your own defense and security identity, not always walking in America's shadow, as it were. And now we've got a strategic compass which takes it further. And because of the war in Ukraine, there's talk about having a more, defense capability. So all of that agenda suits Macron and comes from Macron. And that's become sort of the dominant narrative here in Brussels at the moment when you talk about foreign and security policy. He also engineered, along with Merkel, this recovery plan, the post-COVID-19 recovery plan, which mutualizes European debt. So that's kind of like the Hamilton moment, if you like, that we talk about. Now he's trying to change or reassess European farm policies, so really having an influence on domestic policies within the European Union. And then on foreign policy, I don't have to tell you, relations with Africa. For months, the European Union was trying to bring the African Union and African leaders to a summit with them in Europe. And the Portuguese tried, it didn't happen. The Slovenians tried, it didn't happen. Well, of course, they came when France beckoned, when Macron beckoned. So that's, of course, a big asset for Europe to have a man like Macron, a country like France. In the Indo-Pacific, France plays the card that it's a resident Indo-Pacific power. So that has real, let's say, a reason to be in the region. And then, of course, he's played a role actually on putting the brakes on enlargement of the European Union towards the Balkans. So quite a lot of influence. And during the French presidency, is being used very effectively.
Okay, thank you very much, Shada, for this answer. It seems to me, and it's quite clear when I read the foreign press, being based myself in London, or when I give interviews, that there are almost two Macrons. One which is sort of the Macron of how he is perceived and seen by, notably, the foreign media as a kind of a liberal reformer in Europe, okay? And when I look at the way, most of the people in France today, particularly his critics, of course, speak about him as a rather illiberal leader and even conservative. We've had that discussion with Sophie at the beginning. So there are two types. And I think that the crucial issue of migration and refugees is quite telling, because on the one hand, in Europe, he sounds one of those liberal reformers, but when it comes to its own treatment of migrants and refugees, think of Calais, for instance, which is not far from us, that's a different proposition. So do you believe in the two Macrons, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde theory, or in a sense, there's no difference. There's only one leader, doesn't adapt, and he's, one way or another.
So, here in Brussels, I have to confess, I was one of the people who were really sort of celebrating when Macron was elected, because I thought he'd come in with a young language of inclusion, and there was quite a lot of diversity around him, and he had that kind of vibe that was, I thought, quite impressive. But I have to say, in the last 2 or 3 years, Philippe, and of course Cole and Aurélien have referred to it, his very hard policies, we'll talk about Islam later, but now I'm just talking about policies that I think are really driving Europe to the right. It's a strong paradox, really, because after Olaf Scholz was elected in Germany, and you've got Sanchez in Spain, you've got Da Costa in Portugal, Draghi, who's center left in Italy, you would say that you have some very strong center leftist politicians and leaders. But the whole conversation, and I think France is partly responsible for mainstreaming that conversation, is drifting, as Aurélien has very rightly said, to the right. And I think that's because, first of all, the personality of Macron, the strength of the French diplomacy, the fact that, what happens in France, as I said to you, sort of permeates and percolates down to other countries through media links, through think tanks, through television shows and stuff. But mainly, I think it's because the European Commission has a majority of center-right politicians, so the European People's Party, which is very sympathetic to some of the ideas that Macron is promoting as regards controls on immigration, treatment of refugees, and also, of course, this anti-culture wars, anti-woke kind of message that France is bringing to the wider Europe and being picked up very quickly by media. So first of all, you have a European executive that is quite strongly in the hands of politicians who are rightist. I mean, you may remember that we have a European Commissioner, believe it or not, who's there to protect or promote the European way of life, which is really a dog whistle to the far right. And the fact that von der Leyen, the Commission president, has actually got a commissioner doing that, I think it's very significant of her way of thinking. I mean, she went to Greece in 2020, early 2020, and praised the Greek government for being the shield of Europe against, against migrants and refugees coming in from the south. So you've got that culture thing there going on. We do not want American ideas on racism. And I'll give you an example of how that is sort of really infecting is the word I'll use. So yesterday, for instance, was International Day Against Racial Discrimination. And there was an EU anti-racism summit. And there's been an EU anti-racism action plan, which came out after the death of George Floyd. And that action plan is very ambitious and talks about structural racism and talks about unconscious bias. It's really quite a progressive, if you like, an ambitious, progressive, and I say quite remarkable plan. Well, yesterday's, though it's the French presidency, the French were not present at this summit at all. Not even Elizabeth Moreno, who is the Minister for Integration, who had said she'd be there. So they're really sort of disconnecting and really getting away from anything that happens in the EU Commission or in the Parliament that has progressive kind of ideas or concepts. And I think that's really quite interesting. And it is happening as we speak. And this is not going to go away. Once these things happen, they tend to become part of the narrative, unfortunately.
All right. Thank you, Shada. Finally, you wrote Well, I think is a very powerful piece, which was published in The Guardian in January 2022 about the rise of Islamophobia in France. And I should say that probably the rise in the French media, in the French political class in the first place, rather than the French society at large. And you were warning of how it may impact on Europe as a whole, you know, because of the sort of way of handling cultural, religious differences in France. And I just wanted to finish, and before we take, because I see we've got at least 5 questions from the floor, just how France is viewed, perceived, if you like, abroad in Europe, you know, the way France treats its minorities, notably, and the Muslim minority in the first place. Is there, because as you know, there are strong debates, I think, related to, mentioned it, you know, with all the culture wars, the moral panic, and all this endless discussions on laicite, Republican values, Islam, and the laws, the bills which were passed by the government, by the way, also on that, the so-called law on separatism. So what is the perception abroad in Europe about the way France has been dealing with its minorities and diversity from Europe?
Yeah, so the thing is, again, Philippe, I mean, there is a contagion. I'm not saying that it's because of France that there is a strong Islamophobic tendency across the European Union, by no means. You know, the Fundamental Rights Agency and other agencies have well documented for years the rise of anti-Muslim hatred or Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. So it's not just coming from France, though I think once again, because you have such a powerful personality in Emmanuel Macron, and because you've had these very emotional and toxic, and I would say rather poisonous debates in France, and there's a spillover effect because we can watch French television, you know, we know Zemmour from way back, and we follow all of French politics as though it was our domestic politics because of its, you know, how porous our borders are. So I think that conversation has become more toxic. The narrative has become more damaging and more Islamophobic than in past years. I mean, I've been tracking this for the last 22 years or so, since 9/11, really, and I've seen it just grow and worsen with no pushbacks. And this is where I really think we have a problem, is we have countries like Spain, like Sweden, like Portugal, you know, which are not following in that line, you know, who are pushing back against some of the very obvious forms of Islamophobia, but they're not really having an impact. And I think that's because the French narrative, especially during this presidency, people seem to think, oh, you can't really do anything now because, you know, elections are coming up in Paris. You know, there are going to be elections in France, so we can't do anything to harm Emmanuel Macron's, you know, hopes of, you know, being re-elected. So let's just push back, sit back for the moment and let him do his thing. And that's the reason that for the last, actually not just this year, but for the last 2 years, because we've seen these elections coming, and there's been such a thing about, oh my God, Marine Le Pen is rising, and now we have Zemmour, etc. People have been saying, oh, but let's not rock the boat. So a lot of those ideas have allowed and have been allowed to spread. And so anything that has any picture of a European commissioner with a woman with a headscarf, there's suddenly, you know, Twitter feeds, etc., saying, you know, she's sympathizing with Islamo-leftists, or it's turned into, I was going to say an art form, but a very, I would say, disgusting form of art, if that's the way, because it really does lead to a kind of criminalization and stigmatization of Muslims. They connect all terror attacks and all Muslims put in the same boat together. And it creates a kind of feeling of us and them, which is constant. And now I'll just give you an example. During this Ukraine war, I mean, you know, there have been allegations, and I think rightfully, about double standards, you know, Ukrainian refugees being, you know, brought in and getting all the best treatment, whereas others from other countries, if they're Black or brown or Muslim, aren't getting. So that conversation is getting very, very upsetting for people like myself, and, you know, many other people who believe that in this EU of equality, or this union of equality. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now we're going to open the floor, and I see in the chat, and I think our guests can also see the questions. So I think I'm going to simply scroll down and take probably there are 5-6 questions. I haven't had time. I'm going to discover the questions just now, in fact. I think the first question is probably for Aurélien, but I would say to everyone here, our guest, of course, if you want to comment on any questions, I mean, take the floor. But I think the first one is clearly for Aurélien, although it was basically kind of my question, also one of my questions about how fungible is the Zemmour electorate with the Rassemblement National? Does it have a more bourgeois demographic, and does it make it easier for alliances with the center-right? So if you could briefly get back to that, Aurélien, or say more if you want to, of course, and just brief answers so that we can sort of try to answer all questions here.
Thanks, Philippe. Well, I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it's hard to know exactly how big that electorate is yet, and exactly where it's coming from. I mean, according to opinion polls so far, it seems that it is a more bourgeois electorate. It's a kind of old school. I mean, it's either kind of what would have been a traditional kind of far right, extreme right electorate back in the day, if you want, not necessarily age-wise like that, but it's people who have generally a bit more money, who are a bit more kind of middle class, upper middle class, who would be turning to Zemmour. That's how it seems anyway. And I think that's going to make it very interesting for the second round, is to see where they would be going, depending on who obviously is in the second round, and whether, you know, whether they would turn to Macron, for example, if Macron was faced with Mélenchon, or whether they would turn to Pécresse if Pécresse was faced with Macron, or to Marine Le Pen, or whether they want something else, or whether they are just or whether they would abstain. So I think that will be interesting to actually see who is behind Zemmour, because I think what's interesting, and it goes back to what some of what Cole was saying in terms of the electorate. There is certainly an electorate, but it will be fascinating to see actually the people who will vote for Zemmour, because voting for Zemmour is a very strong symbol. And I think Zemmour is still far more taboo than Marine Le Pen is nowadays. It's a bit like voting for Jean-Marie Le Pen back in the 1990s, if you want. It is something that few people dared doing. And it's quite a sign, I think, to do that. So whether then these people would turn to someone else, I'm not sure. Sure, because that shows a radicalization.
As you say, it's a more middle class, more wealthy electorate than Le Pen's.
Yeah, I mean, that's what opinion polls say, right? And so we have to take them with a grain of salt, obviously. But it seems like, and this is what Zemmour is attracting. And if you look at the rallies, for example, that he's been doing, it seems over people who are around him and all that, it seems to be this more kind of traditional extreme right. The people who have moved from the Rassemblement National to Zemmour as well seem to show that it's more this kind of traditional, more middle class, upper class, old nationalist / racist electorate and supporters.
Okay, we seem to have suddenly quite a few questions, but I'm just asking our guests here if you would like to comment on that question, or that's fine. I think you're all happy with Aurélien's question. I think the second question will be for probably Sophie or Cole, about if Macron wins, meaning probably wins the presidential election, a cohabitation seems a distinct possibility. Which parties are most likely to take advantage? So probably explain also probably for the non-French audience, not so acquainted with French politics, what cohabitation is. Sophie, do you want to take that question?
Yep, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think cohabitation is when you're governing with a president from one party and a government from another. So we talked about this earlier when Chirac and Mitterrand were both re-elected at a time when this was what was going on. I think personally, the way I see the legislative elections most likely to pan out is that if Macron wins, let's say, and if Pécresse doesn't, I think you're going to see, as I said earlier, this sort of a real kind of volatile situation among deputies in the Republican Party, which will mean some of them will be scrambling around looking for ways to save their own seats, and that may mean then jumping into support Macron for the legislative elections, for example. And I think that what the most likely outcome is not cohabitation at all. It's going to be probably a majority for a broader version of a sort of En Marche plus. So you have En Marche, you'd have Edouard Philippe's party Horizons, you'd have these other kind of groupings that would become part of a broader presidential majority. But that wouldn't be the same as cohabitation, because cohabitation implies that you really are almost in confrontation between the president and the government, the prime minister. And I just don't, that's the way that's my hunch, that's my analysis. I just don't see that that's likely to happen, because I think if the Republicans don't win don't even get through to the second round of the presidential, really strong legislative campaign just the following month.
Yes, absolutely. I think if Macron wins the presidency, particularly emphatically, logically, he should also get a majority following that. I think the general election will follow in June, I think. So it's quite soon after the election. I think there will be a kind of a momentum for him, but we shall see. There's another question on CNews. I don't know if, Cole, you want to, I just read out, those CNews have the same influence as Fox News in the USA. That's probably a question for you. Does the same partisan media bubble exist in France, or is there still a national forum for debate and discussion? This is a good question about the state of the media in France. Big question.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. I think I don't think the same level of partisan media bubbles exist in France, despite the rise of this sort of form of media. So again, basically, we're talking about CNews, Europe One. There are some, far right magazines that people read, but I don't think we have quite the same level of bubbles that you do have in the US. People that are watching CNews are probably familiar with what's being discussed on France 2 or France 3, which are the main TV networks, or even TF1. So it's not quite to the same level there. I guess I'll just be brief and leave it at that, I think.
Thank you, Cole. The next question is about who's having the best campaign so far. It's a weird campaign. Sophie started by saying it's probably few rallies. Probably it's a post-pandemic thing, and also the war now interfering. Who's having really a good campaign, and who's really, probably by contrast, having a very dull campaign? Do campaign, particularly on the campaign trail, still matter? Who wants to probably... Sophie again?
I don't, just a very quick answer to that. I mean, if Macron wins, one's going to have to say he did have a good campaign, but he hasn't actually been campaigning. So it's an absolute paradox. And he's been refusing to take part in first round debates. So I think it would be a very odd way to sort of credit him with a good campaign. But it would be a logical thing to do. I mean, the person who's campaigned the best, I would say, is Mélenchon, because when you look at the way he has risen in the polls in recent weeks and come from a position of, relative sort of peripheral position to being considered a credible contender for the second round runoff. I think you have to look at, he's a bit of a specialist at doing these last minute surges. He did it in 2017 and it looks like he's doing it again, or he's at least capable of doing it. So I think he probably would be the one who's, at this point, you'd say has run the best campaign in terms of efficiency.
Yes, he calls himself the shrewd turtle, sort of making slow but steady progress and gains. That's what he said. Yes, I think I would agree with that. So a question now about the opinion polls. Some people do not believe in opinion polls. I said opinion polls are just, it's a snapshot of the moment. People change their mind about whom they're going to vote for, and they might change their mind from abstention to voting for someone, or they might change candidates. So that's also something to bear in mind. So, for instance, someone is writing here in the chat that Zemmour's poll ratings are exaggerated. It's hard to tell, of course, and but I think overall, what is for sure, I know if someone wants to take that question, or we move on, but is that there's a kind of consistency in the poll with Macron ahead, followed by Le Pen. And now clearly the momentum seems to be for the third man, Mélenchon. I think, do you all agree with that? Aurélien?
I mean, just one quick thing about opinion polls as well. I think you're right. I mean, I would agree with what you just said, but I think opinion polls, we tend to see opinion polls as a snapshot, even though you said we don't, but like quite often they're like, oh, this is what's happening, but it's also about how opinion polls are shaping what's happening next, and how people are going to see like that Macron is far ahead, and maybe they'll be like, well, actually, I don't care for Macron that much, so maybe I'll stay home because there's no point me voting for him, or there's no point giving him such a big victory in the first round. And this is, again, what happened in 2002, where people were like, well, we know what's going to happen in the second round, so either we'll stay at home or we'll vote for someone more radical or someone different, or just kind of, you know, show the two main leaders, but we're not, you know, we don't love them, let's say. So I think it's also what the polls are doing at the moment, you know, and there's going to be a lot of movement in terms of, as someone said, I can't remember who before, but, you know, when left-wing voters are going to see that maybe their preferred candidate has no chance to reach the second round, but that them voting for their preferred candidate might mean that Mélenchon doesn't make it to the second round. What do people do? And I think that will be interesting as well. So it's also what the role that polls play in shifting vote and in shifting the landscape. I think that we need to discuss more, I think, in politics generally.
Okay, thanks. I think suddenly we have lots of questions, and I said we would finish at 7:30. So probably we're going to take couple of more questions, and that would be it. I'm sorry if we can't take all questions. There was another question, sorry Barbara, about CNews. I think we've already sort of discussed the role of CNews in the French media and its impact on the French political life. I'm just trying to select questions which on topics we haven't really discussed yet. Oh, it's an interesting question about Le Pen, also still this year faring strongly, you know, and in contention for the second spot, and to be there again in the second round against probably Macron. And the question is about it's a female candidate, and it's a question about the role of gender in the campaign. You know, is really French politics more feminized? Is gender an issue? I don't know who would like to answer that question. Is there something important to say about that? The role, it's true, we have several, they're in the minority, but we have several female candidates. 3 at least out of 12, which is really minority.
Yeah, I can say something, Philippe, but it's more just to say that, sorry, I'll give you the floor in a second, Sophie. Just to say that it's quite interesting. I think that it's the right, of course, the far right, but that has gone for this option. You know, Pécresse and then Marine Le Pen. And of course, there are others prominent far right, like Marine's niece. And I just think that this is quite an interesting phenomenon. I think Sophie can explain it better to me, but it's not unusual, because here in Europe as well, I mean, here in Europe, in the EU, the first Commission president is also from the European People's Party, so from the Christian democracy, not from the left either. So there's something to be said about far right parties trying to get maybe the female vote, maybe a little bit more than our center left or leftist parties, but I leave it to Sophie to come in.
I mean, nothing to add of a huge significance, just to say that don't forget that Anne Hidalgo is the candidate of the Socialist Party.
Oh,
so
yes, sorry.
A major candidate, or at least ought to be a major candidate, is a woman on the left. She's polling at 2%, as you said, so it doesn't look major, but her party is an important party, or was. And then Nathalie Arthaud on the far left, don't forget her. So there are actually 4 candidates that I can think of who are women, and they cover the entire spectrum, which is kind of interesting, I think, and in a way sort of is normalizing. I quite take your point, Shadra, about the far right and this particular role of women sometimes in far right movements, but this is a French election where it's quite interesting. I think it's almost normalized, because you have candidates across the spectrum, including in the mainstream left, socialist, the mainstream centre-right, Républicain, have got female candidates for the first time ever. So in some senses, even if they don't get anywhere, there's a bit of progress there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it will be the last question. I think it's an interesting one, because, and that regards, I think, the left, the future of the left, and its possible rapprochement with the sort of grassroots anti-racist, anti-colonial, pro-environment movements. I think probably it's a question for Cole. Do you see here something interesting going on? Is there any rapprochement? On the contrary, there's a big gap between institutional politics, party politics, and those groups, because yes, in fact, what you've had in France recently is really the rise of those social movements.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, it's hard to answer, because a lot of these, unfortunately, parties on the left are insulated from so much of what happens outside of their little political bubbles, unfortunately. Obviously, there's sort of a natural kind of convergence between some of the environmental movements and the Greens that exist. But I think if we look at the main forces on the left, clearly right now the force that's making the biggest attempt to build links with these movements has to be La France Insoumise, and that extends it as well, and perhaps in particular to anti-racist movements and groups that have been criticizing Islamophobia, even if they don't call it Islamophobia in France. Mélenchon is the only candidate who talks about how we need to stop demonizing Muslims, which sounds very simple, but it's not something you hear a lot from candidates in France, even on the left. Roussel and the Communist Party, not particularly interested in this. The socialists aren't either. And in any ways, I don't think the movements want to be associated with them. And the Greens are still, sort of struggled to cast off this image of being, a sort of more environmentally focused single issue party, especially with the current candidate, Yannick Jadot. So the answer has to be La France Insoumise is the movement that's made the biggest effort to at least represent, articulate, and in some cases on lower levels, not the top levels, build ties and have relationships with some of these movements that we've seen emerge in the last few years.
Okay, and now just a few words, voters turnout, abstention, what do you reckon? I'm sort of putting the question to all guests here who wants to, because of course it may impact greatly on the outcome of the election. The sort of how big the abstention is on the day, and we could be in for an upset, notably for the second spot if abstention is high or low. What is to be expected in this respect? Sophie, maybe?
I mean, all presidential elections tend to have higher turnouts than other elections. I mean, that's an obvious starting point. And so the expectations are quite high in the French presidential elections. They're really, really quite good turnout. I think it will be lower this time. I think that particularly the prospect of there being a repeat of the 2017 matchup, that's to say Macron against Le Pen, is putting a lot of people off. And although that ought to be a mobilizing force in terms of producing, boosting the result or the scores for the other candidates in the first round, I think there is a sense of sort of exasperation in anticipation of that being the second round choice again. So I would expect there to be a lower turnout. And I think one of the big debates we're going to have in France after this election campaign, if Macron wins on a lower turnout, is the question of legitimacy and what kind of charges are going to be leveled against a second-term president who has been elected on a lower turnout after a campaign in which he didn't engage in first-round debates. I think that is going to be something he will be probably wise to tackle head on earlier rather than wait for that charge to be leveled against him afterwards.
Yeah, it has started already, in fact. And I think also to add to what you've just said, a Macron-Mélenchon contest would probably boost the voters' turnout. I think they would be more politicized second round, but we shall see. Anyway, we have to leave it there. I'm really sorry again if we haven't been able to answer all questions. There were a few questions to start with, and then suddenly I saw a list of questions, about 10 of them, and I think I really tried to pick the questions which hadn't been addressed or answered yet. Virtual round of applause to our guests. Thank you so much to all of you for being there tonight, and it's been a very enlightening and very interesting panel discussion. And I hope the audience there, you're still quite a lot of you have stayed until the end, and I thank you also for sort of attending this event and for putting the questions. So thank you all very much. Have a nice evening, and we shall see who wins that election pretty soon. And we shall see who, first of all, qualifies for the second round it will be in less than 3 weeks' time. Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.